So if I asked you, do Catholics worship Mary and the saints, or what's up with confession? Is it totally necessary? Or who has true authority? Does the Pope actually have true authority from Jesus Christ? Would you know the answers to those questions? Now, you should be saying, yes, I do. And the reason why is because in the first part of this answering common objections to the Catholic faith from the Frankie D'Astoli show, we went over those things. Now, that was the episode last week. If you did not catch that episode, you don't necessarily need to listen to that before listening to this episode. It's not necessarily like they go linear, but I do recommend that you go back and listen to that because today we are covering a few additional objections and we're really setting up a sequence of episodes where we are going to talk about the sacraments of the Catholic faith and why they help really give us God's grace, right? Of course, we are poured with sanctifying grace at baptism, which we will kind of cover while we go into this sequence of episodes. But ultimately, the sacraments help pour grace back into us and help us get to heaven. So without further ado, welcome back to the Frankie D'Astoli Show. I like to start this episode off by just formally apologizing. I feel like I'm apologizing a lot on the show, truthfully. Last episode, I talked a little bit about a new kind of series that I'm going to be coming out with that focuses more so on real estate investing. So as I had mentioned, if you guys are unaware, I am a full-time real estate investor. That's what I do. That's my job. That's my occupation. I go out with my partner, Steven. We look at properties every day. We put properties under contract. We buy them, we renovate them, we rent them out, we refinance them. We do what's called the BRRRR strategy. That is our primary investing engine. But we do other things as well. We flip houses. We're involved in a few other strategies along those lines. But that's really my main focus. And ultimately, what I've built in Rosary and real estate is combining generational wealth with spiritual poverty. And what that means is when you come in and you're a member of Rosary and real estate, the focal points are how do we grow deeper in our love and communication with Christ? How do we, do things that glorify him every single day? How do we use our work to glorify him? And at the same time, how do we balance that kind of financial obligation that we have to our family? And ultimately, striving to achieve financial freedom so we could pass down assets to our children, assets in the form of houses or other types of things that will ultimately take care of them. That's a big focal point. So we talk a lot about that. And ultimately, what I'm realizing as I'm continuing with the Frankie D'Astoli show is most of my episodes, if not all of them, since I've kind of come back this year, have been focused on faith. And I, of course, love that. I personally love talking about faith more than I enjoy talking about real estate investing, truthfully, because faith truly matters. Of course, investing in real estate, I'm not saying that doesn't matter. Passing down financial freedom and, assets, of course, that matters, at least to myself and to other people that are interested in doing those things. But ultimately, faith should matter to everybody because it talks about salvation. It talks about where your soul is going to be. Because when you die, yeah, you pass down those assets. You can't take them with you. But when you die, your soul goes somewhere, and God willing, it goes up, right? So that's why I definitely like talking about the faith stuff on the Frankie D'Astoli show, probably more than I talk about the real estate, but I want to incorporate the real estate stuff. I think that's really important. And we are going to be dropping episodes on Tuesday that focus around real estate investing, that focus around financial freedom, that focus around financial literacy, because there's just not nearly enough of that. You don't learn how to do your taxes in school. I graduated with a finance degree, guys. I remember in 2023, I think it was, I graduated in 2019. In 2023, I went to do my taxes. It was 2024 for the year of 2023, and it took me 6 hours to do them on TurboTax. Like, I graduated with a finance degree. Now, granted, was I the best student? Absolutely not. I'll be the first to admit that. I had other priorities and focuses in college. And when I look back on it, I realize how jaded all of that was. But ultimately, it shouldn't take me that long. It shouldn't take you that long because the realities are we don't learn these things. We don't learn about taxes. We don't learn about credit cards. We don't learn about how to buy a house. All of these things that are just natural parts of life we don't learn. And I think that's very problematic. That's why my wife and I are very much hardcore on homeschooling, among a bunch of other factors. But ultimately, the Frankie D'Astoli show, those Tuesday episodes, they're going to be built around that financial literacy, getting a little bit better of an understanding on how to manage money, how to utilize money to make more money, how to pass down assets that are going to provide for your children when you're gone, things along those lines. So those are the Tuesdays. And I apologize for not getting that first episode in this Tuesday. This weekend was just absolutely crazy and chaotic in the best way possible. It was my son's birthday on Sunday, and then it was my birthday on Monday. If you're watching the video here, of course, everybody knows I love my Dopios. I love my coffee. This was one of the gifts that I got. This actually was from my in-laws, my sister-in-laws, my brother-in-laws. They got me some nice Dopio cups. But if you look over here, I also have this awesome replica of the crown of thorns. Of course, the crown of thorns that Jesus Christ wore when he was when he died on the cross during his passion, and that was gifted to me by my lovely wife Christina. So I'm putting it here for the show. I keep it on my desk behind me, and I like to utilize it to meditate in the morning, especially as we're in this time of Lent. So it was a great birthday for me. Even more was seeing my son turn 1, Francis. We had Francis's first round party because he's just a total fighter, that kid. And it was basically Rocky themed. And if you are, someone who grew up with Rocky like I kind of did, it was basically like a party that I dreamed of having for myself. So it was very, very cool. And it was really, really awesome. But I am definitely excited to kind of kick back into gear a little bit. I had a great off day on Monday, thanks to my team at D&D Equities for holding down the fort. And we're back. We're going to get rocking. So last week, we covered a few topics on common objections from the Catholic faith. And we started actually not even in regards to the Catholic faith, but just more of in general. Why is there evil in the world? We talked about that. We also talked about do Catholics worship Mary and the saints? What's going on there? We talked really in depth about that. I highly recommend you go back and listen to that. We talked about some great things there. We also talked about confession, and we talked about the Pope. So we're going to kind of be continuing with some of those things. And I wrote down kind of the few next ones that we're going to cover. The first one is the rules of the Catholic faith. Like, right, why are there so many rules? And I think a very easy way to kind of put this into perspective is, because we like to talk about financial literacy and things along those lines, is more so, let's just say you were given $100,000, right? I want you to take a second and think about what you would do with $100,000. Now, some of you guys might say, I'm going to put it in a savings account and it's going to earn, 3 to 4%, and it may be a CD or something along those lines. And I'm just going to, house it and hold it. And when my children, come of age, I'm going to distribute some of that money to them, and whatever the case may be. Or you might say, I'm going to, use it as a down payment on a house. And that's a good move. That's great. That's awesome. You might be saying, man, I'm going to buy myself a fresh Ferrari. I'm going to go out and buy a lot of clothes. I'm going to do these things. Or you might say, I'm going to take a trip to Vegas and I'm going to blow it on things that probably shouldn't be doing. Now, regardless of what you're saying there in regards to how you want to go about that, the way that I think about the Catholic faith is, I think about it in that sense, right? Jesus Christ comes, he dies on the cross for us, he's resurrected. Let's just say you are baptized in the Catholic Church, right? You are filled, and the sanctifying grace is poured into you. Original sin is washed away. You are now with God. You are united with the Holy Trinity. It's beautiful, right? A lot of people will say, cool, that's enough. Baptism is enough. It's enough to get me to heaven. It's enough to do everything that it needs to do. I no longer need to go to church. I don't need to go to mass. I don't need to receive the Eucharist. I don't need to go to confession. I don't need to fast on Fridays from mead and all this other stuff. I don't need to, do all of these rules that the Catholic faith is outlining. And essentially what you would be saying, if we relate that to money, is basically, cool, I have $100,000. I'm going to go spend it how I want to spend it. Sure. You have every right to do that. As we talked about in the first part of this, all of us have free will. You could absolutely go and spend that money how you want. However, is that the most prudent thing to do? No, not necessarily, right? So that's where you look to, okay, how do I maybe invest this wisely? How do I nurture this $100,000 so that maybe it turns into $1 million or whatever so be that it is after that? And that's how the Catholic faith is looked at as well. There's boundaries. There's rules. Sure, you could call it that. But ultimately, the point is to keep you in communion with God. And when you look at sin is, as we talked about in the last episode, right? Imagine it like a cord. When you're baptized, you have that strong cord with God, right? With the Holy Trinity. It's very, very tight. Mortal sin is like a samurai sword. It slices it, right? Venial sins is kind of like maybe like a little bread sword, or not sword, excuse me, like a bread knife or something like that. That's just kind of nicking at that cord. And eventually, if you have enough venial sins, it will sever that cord. Sin cuts that communication. It cuts that cord with God, right? It separates us. That's what sin is. Truly, the definition of sin is that separation between God and us. It's something that comes in that divides us, right? That's why all good things come from God. And sin is when you take those things and you twist it. For instance, talk about lust, right? Lust is a very common sin, especially now with, pornography and how profound it is and how free and available it is. It's very, very easy for men to fall into lust. It's literally right in front of them, right? It's one of the devil's greatest tools. But you take what, lust is, and if you rewind it back, it is the union between two fleshes becoming one, right? Man and woman. I was listening to Father Mike Schmitz. He does the Catechism of the Year. I highly recommend it. He said something that really stood out to me. Every single system within the human body is fully developed and, individual. It's able to stand on its own, except for the reproductive system, right? In order for children to be born into the world, you need a woman and you need a man. And they need to come together and become, in a sense, one flesh, right? So that was how God designed it. And the sacrament of marriage holds that union in that sacrament and allows it to be fruitful and allows it to, as we are called to do, multiply. But when you twist that pleasure that comes with that marriage sacrament, you have things like, premarital sex, and you have things like one night stands and all of those kind of uncomfortable things to talk about, but the truth, right? So the church has the sacrament of marriage as a way to guide you to using that properly and to be in communion with God. Because if you are doing those things outside of marriage, it is a sin. Now, these are hard things, obviously, to talk about. And I'm absolutely not perfect. And that's why we have confession. And you can go back and listen to the other episode on that. But that's an example, right? So these rules help us maintain that sanctifying grace that was poured into us at baptism and ultimately achieve heaven. We live in a fallen, broken world. The devil runs the world to a sense. Right now, of course, Christ has power over all things. So I want to be very careful in how I necessarily say that. But the devil is absolutely present in the world. And at times it could look like almost evil is overcoming and overtaking, right? I think a lot of us could say that we kind of feel that way right now to a degree. So when you are exposed to that, if you do not have the sacraments, if you do not have the guidelines, the guardrails, the quote unquote rules that everybody's kind of complaining about to some degree, you could absolutely fall off the deep end and your soul could be in jeopardy and you could end up in hell. It's the reality, right? Again, and we're going full tilt to start this episode here, but that's important. So when you look at so many rules, a lot of people are saying there's a lack of freedom, or there's a lack of freedom. Like, oh my goodness, I can't watch the football game on Sunday. I need to go to church. Boring, annoying rule, right? Oh my goodness, I can't use contraception, right? Oh my goodness, I can't, trying to think of another example here, right? Like I can't, go and excessively gamble. These things that are our reason sometimes can mess with us and say, hey, it's okay to do these things. And that's where the church comes into place. They back it. They back all of it with their tradition, with scripture, with the Pope's authority. It's all backed by the Catholic Church so that you do not go off the deep end. And one other example that you can kind of think about this is, imagine you're standing on like a cliff, right? Well, actually, backtrack that. You're just standing in a playground and you look out and there's a fence. And it goes in a big circle around you, and it's yards and yards away, right? It's deep out there, but you know that it's there. It's an outer rim and it's bordered. You run to that outer rim and you see that fence and you're standing there and you're like, why is this fence here? All right. What's the point of this? And you say, you know what? I'm going to take my car and I'm going to ram it through this fence. So you get in your car and you pop it in drive and you floor the thing and you ram it through the fence. And all of a sudden you're flying off a cliff. And you fall onto rocks and that's it. You're done, right? That is the way that the church keeps everybody kind of enclosed. It's not a border where you're saying, there's a lack of freedom. You're, a prisoner here. It's a border to make sure you do not go off the deep end, to make sure that you remain in the graces of God and you stay in communion with him so that when that time comes and you do die, you are united with him. So that's kind of the one for why are there so many rules? When you think about discipline, don't think about oppression, right? Think about how, freedom, it comes from, Jocko Willink. I'm going to quote him out here if you're familiar with him, big leadership guy. Discipline equals freedom. When you go to mass every Sunday and you receive the Eucharist, you receive that soul food that's going to transform your heart, make you more like Christ. When you sin and you go to confession, your sins are abolished, you reestablish that cord. All of that is important. So that's the first one. The second one, celibacy of priests. I love this one. I really do. And of course, I'm not a priest. So, some priests out there might say I don't, right? And that's the realities of the situation. But I think this is a really common one. I think a lot of people, and I remember I posted a little bit about this and I got some decent heat on some of this stuff. A lot of people are like, wow, these Catholic priests, they can't get married. Like, what's up with that? What's the point of that? That seems wrong. It seems harsh. It seems in a way almost hurtful, right? It's like, why would the priest tell them they can't get married? They're forcing them to, not be able to utilize something that is a good thing to do, right? Getting married, all of that stuff. As you just talked about, Frankie, you just said that, the sacrament of marriage is a beautiful gift from God, that, two fleshes becoming one in that union and procreating is a gift from God. And it absolutely is, right? So why are priests not married, and why are they also celibate, right? So to answer the celibate part, that's going to be probably pretty obvious off of the front end, right? That intimacy is meant to be in the sacrament of marriage. That's the purpose of it. If you're not within the sacrament of marriage, then you should be remaining celibate, right? Even if you're not a priest, if you are just single, yes, you should be remaining celibate. And again, these are hard teachings. I'm not sitting here saying, standing on a pedestal saying you guys are doing it wrong. Like I went to University of Delaware. The very first episode of the Frankie D'Astoli show was called Frat Start a Father. Like I have history, and I'm not saying that, right? But I've also experienced, the grace of confession and kind of a reversion to a degree, which some of you guys might have experienced as well. But ultimately, that's what you're called to do, right? If you are not married, you are called to be celibate, regardless if you're a priest or not. Now, priests take a vow of celibacy. Why do they do that? Why do priests take a vow of celibacy, and why are they not married? Well, priests are, in a sense, an image of Christ, as we are all called to be. But they hold a special, image, a special obligation, a special privilege, where they are the shepherds. They replicate the shepherds. So Christ was unmarried, remained celibate his whole life. That is just one of many, many examples of how priests replicate the prototype, Christ, who they have been given authority from and who they are the mediator to his people, right? That's how they replicate it. So in that sense, they are not going to get married, but they do have a spouse. They do have a wife. Do you know who that is? I'll give you a second to think about it. The Holy Church. That is their spouse. That is their wife. And what are they called to do? They are called to do the exact same thing that husbands are called to do in the sacrament of marriage with their wife, which is to lead the wife to heaven and to be willing to die for the wife. And how does the priest lead the church to heaven? Well, whoever is among the faithful is the church, and he is called to lead them to heaven. How can the priest die for his people, just as Christ died for us, right? And I want you to think about this now. So that's more of kind of a theological view on it. That's more of the church teaching view on it. But I want you to think about it in more practical views. I've had people comment on my posts saying, my pastor is married, and for that, I love it because he's able to give marriage advice. Priests can't give marriage advice. Guys, I'm just letting you know that is so wrong. And you only know it's wrong if you've experienced it, right? I've had some unbelievably good marriage advice come from my priests that I've talked to. And the reason that is for two reasons. A, they're from an outside perspective, right? They are looking at it from an outside lens. The pastor that's married, he has some of that, maybe he's got a certain connection where maybe his wife kind of does something and he feels a particular way about it. So when he hears you say something like that, he's going to double down and be like, oh yeah, like my wife has done that too. And this thing, and I'm not saying that he's going to do that, right? Like he could be very poised about the situation and he could absolutely be neutral in that sense, right? But the priest totally looks at this in a neutral perspective. He's not looking at it from the sense of, oh yeah, my wife's done that also. It really ticks me off. I'm with you on that. I think this is why this needs to change, right? He's not from that perspective. It's totally third party, totally outside lens. But second to that, they give really great advice because the church, again, acts as their spouse. And just as they nurture and care for the church, they're able to guide husbands and wives to do things along that path as well, right? And there's headship within the church also. So that's a big kind of part in regards to that. But again, from more bringing it back to more of the practical version, Father Chris Alar, who, if you don't listen to, guys, I highly recommend you go listen to some of his, videos on YouTube. He's been coming out with videos for years now. He's with Divine Mercy. His church is in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. My wife and, my whole family, we actually have plans to go there this summer, which I'm really excited about. But he talks a lot about this. He's a Catholic priest, celibate, unmarried, and he talks about how he loves that discipline within the church, right? And he will say, if you ask 10 priests, 9 out of 10 of them are going to say that they enjoy that discipline in the church. And the reason he says is because I can't be 100% priest and 100% husband to a physical wife. He said, I can't do it. I wouldn't be able to give 100% to both. I'd only be able to give 50 and 50. And if I'm giving 50% to my parish and I'm giving 50% to my wife, neither one is satisfying, right? He said the church, his parish is going to crumble. His relationship with his wife is going to fail. You can't be, he's just like, you can't be both of those things, right? You're not actually Batman, where you could be Bruce Wayne and Batman, right? You have to choose. And I think when people think about priests, they don't realize how busy they are. Priests are not just, I work on Sunday. It's absolutely not the case. They are basically on call 24/7, right? Why? Because one of the sacraments within the Catholic Church is extreme unction. Extreme unction, and this is just an example. Extreme unction is when you are on your deathbed and you call a priest to perform extreme unction. They do the Holy Eucharist, they give you the Eucharist, they do confession with you, and they do the anointing of the sick, basically preparing your soul to enter into the afterlife, right? So they're on call all the time. Now let's put that in an example. You're sitting down and you're, eating dinner with the family, or you're watching a movie, or you're at the movies and you drove your family to the movie theater and you get a call and it's somebody who's on their deathbed and they need extreme unction. So, man, I'm sorry, John. I'm really sorry. But this movie that I'm watching right now with the wife and kids, it's just getting really good. I'm not going to be able to make it, but I'll say a prayer from you from here. Terrible, right? We can't, that stuff can't happen. That's just an example of why you can't be a priest and you can't be a husband in a physical marriage. It won't work, right? And that's just one example. I'm telling you guys, priests are extremely busy. They do spiritual direction. They're constantly involved in charitable work. They're traveling. They're doing all of these things. It's not as easy as it sounds to just let them get married. Now, I will throw it into a second realm, right? Priests are unmarried. However, they do have a spouse. They're married to the church, right? And they have the obligation, just as husbands do, to die for their spouse. You're a married person, right? I'm a married person. I have 2 kids. I have a beautiful wife. Things are getting crazy, let's just say. And there's persecution of Christians, right? There's persecution of Christians, which is happening all over the world right now. And you are called to, stand up and defend the faith and do those things. And of course, all of us are called to do that. But when you have a husband, when you have a wife and you have children, it's not always easy to stand up and say something that goes against the tide. Why? Because you have people that depend on you. And even though as a husband and a father, you might be locked in, and this is really good and you should be, Christ is king, right? And you go out and you proclaim it and you say it. Here's what could happen. You go out and you say it, just as, I attempt to do on social media and all of those things. There's so many great, Catholic influencers and do those things. And you get a bunch of hatred. And that hatred starts affecting your family. They track you down. They're stalking your wife. They're approaching your kids in school, right? And this is, again, a little bit of an extreme case, but can happen and has happened. As a husband and as an influencer, odds are you're probably going to pull it back a little bit because you're like, this is crazy. It's affecting my family, right? Priests do not have a physical wife and physical children. Of course, they have the church, they have the faithful, but they can and should and are called to be the shepherd that defends the sheep from wolves. When things are going awry and there's persecution against Christians, they should be the first ones up at bat to say, this is wrong. This is what we need to do, and to be preaching that in their sermons, to be representing that. And ultimately, if it leads to them dying for Christ, that is how they replicate Christ, right? And again, we're all called to die for Christ if it ever came down to it. but priests hold a little bit of a different special, occupation there. And by them not being tied to a wife and to children, it makes it a lot easier to a degree for them to do that. And they're obligated to do that. And I think when you look at the Catholic Church right now, you're going to say, man, there's not that many of those priests. And it's sad. There's not. And you see a lot of good, men and women going up and preaching and saying that they, stand for Christ, and they're the ones that are getting persecuted. And that's, extremely problematic. So yes, but to bring it all into a nutshell, they stay celibate, they stay unmarried because that's how Christ was. And ultimately they are married. They are married to Holy Mother Church, and their children are the faithful, and they are called to do just as husbands are called to do, which is die for their spouse and bring their spouse and their children to heaven, which is what they're called to do. So that is how the priest, goes about what they do, and how it does replicate and well, it definitely replicates Jesus Christ, but it also resembles a husband in a regular, sacramental marriage. So that one, I hope that covers that. The third one that we're going to talk about today is scandals in the church. And this is quite an interesting one, because you'll have people that will say, these priests are doing crazy things, right? There's a lot of, scandals in regards to, child abuse, sexual child abuse, which is really, really, satanic. You have, issues and scandals with, liberal type priests promoting things that go against the faith, such as same-sex unions and things along those lines. And people will look at that and they'll say, is this really the church that Christ established, right? Is this what Christ has given us? We have popes that are doing crazy things. They're bringing weird things into the liturgy. And it's a very, respectable question to kind of ask of, like, should I join this church that has an authority, and it seems like they're not doing anything about bad things that are going on, or there's so many bad things going on? Could this really be the church that Jesus established, and should I join this church, or should I leave this church? And I think to bring it back to part one of this, we talked about being on Noah's Ark. And if, Noah and Mrs. Noah are getting into arguments, and the kids are fighting, and, they're doing weird things with the animals, whatever the case might be, you might be tempted to jump off the ark. And the realities are, you don't do that, right? Because you'll die. You're going to land in water and you're going to drown. That's how that will go, right? So you stay on the ark, even though things are getting weird and they're getting, crazy. And I think to answer this question, it's actually very, very simple. Look at Christ and look at the 12 apostles. Who was one of those 12 apostles that everybody knows? No one's going to ever forget his name. And he did the unthinkable. Judas Iscariot, right? Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 apostles. He rolled with Christ on his time here on earth during his ministry. And at the end, he did the unthinkable. He betrayed Jesus Christ. He gave him over to the high priest, who brought him to Pontius Pilate, and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, right? So when you look at the original apostles, you see evil, you see cruelty, you see scandal, right? The scandal of Judas going behind Jesus's back and ratting him out, telling, the high priest and the Hebrews where he was, right? The Jewish people where he was. So from the very, very beginning, there was scandal. Christ also tells us there will be wolves in sheep's clothing. This is not, guys, this isn't new. This has been since the beginning of time. And it doesn't matter if you are in the Catholic Church. It doesn't matter if you go to the Presbyterians, if you go to the Baptists, if you go and you don't follow a church. It doesn't matter. Evil will always be in this world. Scandal will always be in this world. But you stay with the faith. You stay with the church that Jesus Christ established, which, if you are unfamiliar with the Catholic Church being the church that Jesus Christ established, go back 2 episodes ago and listen to Understanding Church History, and you'll know that, and you'll know that in depth. But that is a simple answer to that, right? There's scandal. There's things going on. Does that mean that, this is not the church that Christ established? Does that mean that we shouldn't be a part of the Catholic Church? Absolutely not. And just to kind of reiterate some things, I know last episode we talked about the Pope. I can't say with certainty, right? We don't know, where people's souls go when they die. although saints are canonized, and we could say with absolute certainty in the Catholic faith that a saint is in heaven, and that's a whole nother topic that we could talk about, guys. But there's a big a research level, but there's also supernatural levels as well. There's miracles that occur that are documented, that are researched, X, Y, and Z. But ultimately, if someone is not canonized a saint in the Catholic Church, we all have no idea where they are, right? And if you have, let's just say, a grandparent or somebody who passed away, and you say, heaven gained another angel. Heaven gained another angel in my grandmother. I know you have good intentions on saying that, of course. And of course, our hope is that our family who has passed on is in heaven. Absolutely. There's really just no way of absolutely knowing that. And I'll actually make a whole nother episode on that specific line of my grandmother, heaven gained another angel, because there's actually a lot to talk about just with that particular line. But ultimately, we don't know. So when you look at all the popes, hundreds and hundreds of popes that there's been over, the 2,000 years of Christianity here, we don't know where most of those popes are. Right now, you have some popes that are canonized: Saint John Paul II, Saint Pius XII. All these other popes that were canonized, that are saints, but we don't know where the other popes are, and there's a chance that they are not in heaven. Right? There are some popes all throughout the history of the church, right, that have done bad things. Popes are sinners just like us. They have the sacrament of confession just like we do. So a pope is not the ultimate authority, right? They're not God. We don't look at them as God. We talked about that in the last episode. But having said all of that, it's important that we look to the church to act justly. And I think this is important, right? And I think something that we could maybe truthfully say, even from my end, is just, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of justice being put into action in the Catholic Church as of recently. And this is a qualm that I kind of have to a degree. Doesn't mean that I'm leaving the Catholic Church. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to receive the Eucharist. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to, baptize my children, raise my children, hope they die in the Catholic faith, right? Of course, I'm going to still do all of those things. But ultimately, we can look at things and we could say, hey, that priest did something extremely wrong. They should be held accountable. There's no doubt about that. Justice is a cardinal virtue, right? And that means giving what's due to others. So if a priest acts unjustly to other people, if he's in scandal, if he's doing those things, he should be held accountable. There should be justice. Now, of course, we could look at certain things and we could say, can we show some clemency here? Can we show some mercy here? Potentially, sure. But ultimately, we need to be taking just action. And then I think even more so, we need to look at what's going on before that priest, right? Why did that priest come into the church? Was there signs that maybe, there were some things going on in his background that suggested that maybe he should not be in a position of authority leading the faithful? These are all good questions to ask. These are all common things to look at. But ultimately, the answer isn't leave the Catholic faith because of the scandals. The answer is, why are these scandals happening? How do we, prevent them from happening again in the future and restoring Christ's church to what we know it ultimately is and can be? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. So don't leave the faith because of scandals. Look at the scandals, understand that Christ said there will be wolves in sheep's clothing, but how do we overcome these scandals, and how do we, have a more unified church? So the last one that we're going to talk about is, why not just follow Jesus, right? Why do we need a church in general? And this is a good question, right? And I think people will say, like, I don't need a church, right? And they'll also say, things along the lines of like, I can have a relationship with God. I don't need a church to tell me how to have a relationship with God. And there's absolute truth to that, right? And I think, St. Thomas Aquinas describes this really, really well. This is the difference between philosophy and theology. Philosophy, right, is this. Let's just imagine that you are on a deserted island, right? And you are walking around and you can contemplate things. You can by your own understanding come to an understanding of the fact that there is a God, right? That there's someone who is your creator, right? And you could look at that, just one simple way to kind of understand, not necessarily simple, but one way to understand that is cause and effect, right? I take this pen, I drop it, it causes a noise, and now it's no longer in my hand, right? There's an effect to that, or say the effect is the noise and it's no longer in my hand. I can look at that and I can say, all right, if I am here on this earth, there must have been a cause to this effect. And if you track that cause and effect back and back and back and back, ultimately there has to be one original cause, and that would be God. right? That's one way of someone being able to understand that there is a God without theology. Now, theology brings in divine revelation. Theology goes deeper, right? Think about philosophy as like the handmaid of theology, as Thomas Aquinas would say. So theology goes deeper. You cannot just by being someone on a deserted island, knowing God, you cannot understand that he came, Jesus Christ came from the Virgin Mary. You cannot understand that, Christ needed to die on the cross and be resurrected for the gates of heaven to be open. You can't understand that without theology, without divine revelation. So people will say, I don't need a church. And they'll say, all I need is Jesus, right? And they'll say, all I need is my Bible, right? I just got my Bible, sola scriptura. I don't need a church. I don't need a pope. I don't need anything like that. And again, to understand this, you need to go back and listen to Understanding Church History. But remember this, the church formed the Bible. The church gives sacraments. The church gives baptism. Without those things, you can't have any of that. Without the church, you don't know who Christ is. So all you're saying is, yeah, I can have a relationship with God, just as the, poor nobleman on the deserted island can have a relationship with God, but you cannot know Jesus without the church. Truly, you can't know him truly, right? And even if you know him probably because of the Bible, right? And the Bible was given by the church. The church authority determined what the Bible would be, the 73 books in the Bible, established it, issued it, and now everybody has that and reads it, except, of course, Martin Luther, who came out with the 66 books. But ultimately, that's kind of your answer there. If you're someone who's saying, I don't believe in institutional religion, I don't believe that the church authority should be a thing, what you're saying is that you can go about having Jesus Christ without the church. And of course, you can know Christ even if you walk away from the church. I'm not saying that. But ultimately, bringing it back to the very beginning of the episode, essentially what you're saying is, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to drive through this fence, and I'm going to see what happens. Right? I'm just going to see what happens. I want out of the playground. I want out of the sandbox. I want to go outside. I want to get through that fence. And you can't see past the fence, right? It's not like a clear fence where you can see the cliff. So you have no option but to basically ram your car through and see what happens. And I'm just telling you, again, people that have done that, it's usually not ended well. So all that to say, guys, we actually didn't even get to the show sponsor, so let's just hit the show sponsor real fast. Today's show sponsor is Roman Catholic Gear. If you are in the market for a good rosary, I cannot recommend Roman Catholic Gear enough. Their rosaries are extremely durable, well made, and my personal favorite is they mimic and replicate the World War I rosary that was issued by the U.S. government. Can you believe that? The U.S. government literally issued rosaries to soldiers in World War I, and you have the opportunity to pray with a rosary that replicates that. And again, attached with that is spiritual warfare, right? So you get to pray with this rosary. It's very spiritually strong. They're extremely durable. As someone who has two little kids and they're constantly pulling at them, they do not break, which is awesome. And something that's really cool is when you order through RomanCatholicGear.com, you could have your rosary delivered in this spiritual ammo kit, which also is really cool just to open up, but it makes for great decor in your office or in your home. So if you head to RomanCatholicGear.com, you could use my code Frankie10 for 10% off your order. Stay with the Catholic faith, guys. Stay with the Catholic faith and grow deeper in your faith. Make it a point to learn, but not just learn to learn, right? Learn to be transformed. And I think as I'm going through the catechism in a year, the more that I get into Thomas Aquinas, the more that I learn a lot. I learn a ton. With the new St. Thomas Institute with Dr. Taylor Marshall, I'm learning a lot. And sometimes even myself, I say, am I just learning just to learn? But then I feel and recognize just this overall change and shift in identity. And I realize that I'm being transformed. And I think it's so important. If you're going to study real estate investing, which I love, if you're going to study, your occupation, whether that's in the medicine, the health department, or it's in the education department, or it's in the construction department, or whatever it is, and you're going to study those things and you're going to learn, you're going to go to school to study finance like I did. Study and learn theology, learn divine revelation, help your soul. That is what's so important. And I think that's just so faded and jaded in this time, right? Of course, obviously, we're going to talk about financial literacy on the Tuesday shows, and that's definitely jaded and faded. But ultimately, theology, church history, all of these things are so lost, and they're taking Bibles out of schools. Another reason why we're homeschooling our children. That's a big fact. but there's just so much more to it. So next week, we are going to start getting into some of these sacraments. We're going to start talking through that. We're going to have a series on sacraments as we continue through this Lent period here. And just so we know, and let's just cover the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. You have baptism, you have confirmation, you have the Holy Eucharist, you have reconciliation, you have holy matrimony, you have extreme unction, and you have holy orders. So we're going to go through all 7 of those in the series to come. But again, pray the rosary, buy real estate. Don't do what makes you happy. Do what makes you holy. God bless. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys next week.